This is The Other Side with Damian Coory.
G'day and welcome to the very first episode of The Other Side. I'm Damian Coory. This is the podcast designed to make your life a bit easier by presenting a summary of the best commentary on the big issues affecting Aussies in around 20 minutes a week. I'm hoping it'll help you become more informed about what commentators on the classical liberal and conservative side of political thinking are saying about important issues, and that this will balance the side you're getting from mainstream media, which these days is, well, pretty left-wing. I'm a former Aussie radio and TV journo from the 90s who's just returned home from 20 years living and working overseas, and I'm starting this podcast because I'm worried. I'm worried that Australia's changed in the time I was away, and not in a good way. The biggest worry I see for Australia is that individual liberty is being eroded. I felt this way before I came home and long before COVID. Now, this isn't going to be a show about conspiracy theories. That's not my thing. I just find it hard to believe that humans can be that well organised on such a grand scale. But it's going to be about government overreach and the importance of good old-fashioned classical liberalism and a bit of conservatism as a political philosophy. Because government can be very organised and very dangerous. You see, I spent most of the last 20 years living in the vibrant, beautiful, wonderful city known as Hong Kong, an incredible testament to the wealth that free markets and human innovation can produce. And we're now watching that city being choked by a totalitarian state and huge government beast that wants to intrude into every aspect of people's lives. I've called this podcast The Other Side because I don't think our media is telling the whole story anymore. Newsrooms are full of young, inexperienced kids, like I was in the 1990s, required to produce too much content in too little time. So they follow each other like a pack, and they get locked on a particular narrative and just follow it. Round and round it goes. It's not their fault. There's just no resources. At the ABC, it's much worse. It's a government-funded institution, well-funded, that has an organisational culture that accepts only the ideology taught in our universities. And they're blind to it. They don't see the forest for the trees. They'll argue quite sincerely that there is no bias. But classical liberalism or conservative perspectives don't even see the light of day on panel shows like The Drum or Q&A. They start discussions from the premise that left-wing ideas are carved in stone truths. And they aren't. And the most scary thing about the ABC is we've all got to pay for it, whether we like it or not. And it isn't going to change because journos who don't subscribe to that worldview are simply never going to get jobs there. With that, I say, welcome to The Other Side, your new shortcut to Australia's best commentary. So, COVID-19. Let's start with some statistics. As at the time of recording this podcast, we had a total of 549 deaths with or of COVID-19 in Australia. The government had conducted 5,886,000 tests. The total number of negative tests was just over 5,861,000. The total positive tests was 25,205. So 0.43% of everybody tested positive, and 99.57% of everybody tested negative. And we've tested, about a quarter of the population at this point. The number of people who've recovered from COVID at this point is 20,095. So that means we've got about 5,000 cases still active in the community. As I said, the number of total fatalities with or of COVID recorded is 549. But the number of those deaths under 80 years old is 128. And the number of deaths under 70 years old is 39. And the number of deaths outside Victoria is 87. The death rate as a percentage of the positive tests is about 2.17%. That is not a low death rate. That is a serious thing. This is not a nice illness. It leaves people who don't die with it quite sick, some of them, for a long time. We don't know what the long-term effects are. You do not want to get this thing. But it is killing 1 in 50 of the people who are diagnosed as having a positive test result. So 49 out of 50 are surviving, which is the good news, the good perspective of it, I guess. The mortality rate overall, in terms of our population, is 0.0021%. The mortality rate under 80 years of age is 0.00052%. which means the current chance of not dying of COVID-19 is 99.998%. The current chance of under 80-year-olds not dying of COVID-19 is 99.9995%. And the chance of not dying if you live outside of Victoria is 99.9996%. I haven't even bothered calculating what the current chance of dying is if you're under 80 and live outside Victoria, but you can imagine the 99999s go on for quite a bit longer. Let's compare this to some other types of diseases and causes of death in Australia in 2018. If we look at the latest data on mortality in Australia, the top causes of death were heart disease, 20,725, dementia, 13,963, stroke, cardiovascular disease, about 10,000, lung cancer, 8,500. What else have we got? Flu and pneumonia, about 3,100. Suicides, about 3,046, and that's expected to jump a bit because of COVID and the lockdowns, and even accidental falls, 2,952, and car accidents, we've got that down to 1,135, which is a lot lower than it was in when I was a kid growing up in Australia, where New South Wales would have had that tally all by itself most years. So the chances of dying this thing are pretty slim. It's a bad illness, though, and you don't want to get it, and we do want to protect people from it, and we don't want anyone to die. Of course we don't. But we've got to be managing this in perspective, and that's the issue. Are we managing COVID-19 in a sensible, balanced, rational way, or are we all being scared out of our wits by the media and by politicians who have got other things to gain, and perhaps we are all feeling a little bit more frightened than we need to be. And it's totally understandable that people feel frightened. As I said, this is a rotten illness. You don't want to get it, and it does kill people. There's no question, and we've got to protect the elderly. There's no question about that, but we've got to be sensible and balanced in the way that we manage it. Currently, looking at deaths per million around the world, the UK, 624, the US, 542, Italy, 586, Sweden, which didn't do a lockdown, they had a very minimal lockdown, 571, and Peru, which has had a maximum lockdown, massive lockdown, 865 deaths per million, and they're in the middle of a surge now. Victoria, 68 deaths per million, and the rest of Australia, 4.6 deaths per million Australians. So we have a situation in Australia where we've got state borders closed outside of Victoria. I can kind of understand why you would close the Victorian border at this point, but is there any rationale for the Queensland-New South Wales border to be closed at this stage, other than people are afraid, and the Premier knows that, the Premier of Queensland knows that, and she's got an election coming up on October 31, and, if she goes out there every day and says, we're winning Queensland, like it's a state of origin, some football game or something, and we're not one country, we're a bunch of independent states, she must have missed Federation. But she's out there every day saying, yay, yay, Queensland, go Queensland. And all her followers on Facebook are, yeah, good on you, Premier, you're doing a fantastic job. Well, she's not going to change anything while that's going on, because crises make leaders look good, especially if there's no great impact. So she'll do everything she possibly can to make sure that Queensland does not have one single more death and jumps on every single case that comes in. Now, that could be a good thing for Queensland, or it could be a really bad thing. We're going to find out a little bit later when we hear an fantastic interview with a prominent medical expert from Stanford University in the United States, speaking to our former Deputy Prime Minister, John Anderson, on his podcast. We're going to have a listen to that later on. And that is quite an enlightening interview, because herd immunity is a thing. And if we're going to get through this thing, we've got to get the healthy people carrying the antibody, or at least having resistance to the antibody at a certain level in the community. And then hopefully that's going to be, that is the way that most viruses, and particularly coronaviruses, do eventually die out.
You're listening to The Other Side with Damian Coory, your weekly shortcut to Australia's best commentary.
Now, let's have a look at Victoria. It's pretty hard for people in the rest of Australia to imagine what it feels like to be a Victorian right now. No other major city in the world is there an 8 p.m. curfew being imposed on citizens. Even Manila in the Philippines, a country that loves a bit of a state of emergency, police powers, and a good old curfew, even they aren't locking anyone down in the capital city before 10. Fines at the level of $5,000 up to $20,000. Wow. It's as if instead of inspiring people's support and compliance by treating them as responsible adults, Dan Andrews and his Labor government seem to think we're all children who need to be locked up. And things really popped this week when Andrews announced that he wants to change the law to enable him to extend the state of emergency for up to 12 months. There's apparently all sorts of laws and regulations that can't be brought in unless you have a state of emergency. And you see, the state of emergency was first declared on March 16. And since then, it's been extended every 4 weeks. But the maximum allowed under current law is 6 months. And Andrews will hit that on September 13. So he wants a blank cheque to keep it going until September 13 next year if he needs to. If he decides. All by himself. Well, thankfully, this caused quite a bit of outrage from a number of prominent Victorians this week. Yep, even in good old obedient, socialist-leaning Victoria, they're starting to question the extent of the COVID response. Melbourne's top-rating talk show host, Neil Mitchell, had this to say on 3AW.
I think given the nature of the crisis, you can't remove the powers that Brett Sutton needs. But with power like this, awesome power, goes responsibility. And that's where they're failing, I think. We need a roadmap. We need the Premier to trust us and explain. I mean, we've put up with all these liberties going. We understand he can't be definite. He doesn't know what the figures will be in 2 weeks. But you've got to say, well, look, if they're around this level, we've got a chance of easing restrictions. If we can get to a particular level, we'll allow restaurants and pubs under some conditions. We'll let schools go back, end the curfew. I think masks will stay, of course. And restrictions of some sort will continue. But he needs to tell us what the plan is, if there is one. Victorians are restless and angry. The federal government's clearly angry. But the main focus here should be managing this thing.
Neil Mitchell also spoke on his 3AW program to Chris Lucas, the owner of Melbourne's largest restaurant chain, to get a feel for the impact being locked up is having on people and businesses.
I employ over 1,000, mostly young people. And I can tell you that we've gone into these lockdowns with goodwill and with good intentions as not just business people, but also as a community. And I think that the Premier is disconnected. I think he has a lack of understanding of what's actually going on in the community at the grassroots level. Neil, we've pivoted from a restaurant business to not a takeaway business, but a business that basically has become a counselling business that deals with mental issues of our employees almost on a daily basis.
So what do you need from the Premier? What do you want from him?
We need a plan, Neil. What we need is, and I think there was a line in the sand 2 days ago, and I think this also demonstrates that the Premier is completely disconnected from the community. He dropped a bomb on the community 2 days ago. Ill thought through, poorly conceived.
That's the 12-month lock, the 12-month set of emergency. Yeah.
I mean, we're in a state of curfew, Neil, and the mental state of Victorians is at such distressing levels. It's a sleeper in the community, Neil. The suicide rates, the family bust-ups, the torment, the financial pressures amongst the people of Victoria is extraordinary, and I don't think he understands it, because if he did understand it, he wouldn't have come out 2 days ago and carried on the way he did.
That's Chris Lucas, the owner of Melbourne's largest restaurant chain, speaking to Neil Mitchell on 3AW. And former Liberal Premier Jeff Kennett pulled no punches on 3AW's Drive Time show.
This will destroy Victoria, absolutely destroy it. We are already now facing a tsunami of social and economic woes you cannot even imagine. And the Premier, instead of offering hope, instead of saying we're going to start easing these restrictions from the 14th of September, he's now telling Victorians, forget this year, we're going to kill you next year as well. Tom, I have never, ever heard such an irresponsible, territorial comment in my life by an Australian politician. This just cannot be allowed to happen. He sent out a message today, do not consider Victoria as a place to invest and work, because I, Daniel Andrews, am going to put into place controls that are going to close the state down. So it's not only the wrong message, it is diabolical, absolutely diabolical for Victoria. And the fact that he's talking about it now in August is sending out a signal to every potential investor, this isn't the place to invest.
Former Liberal Premier Jeff Kennett pulling no punches there on 3AW's Drive Time show. Meanwhile, the editor of The Spectator Australia magazine and Sky News commentator Rowan Dean really let Prime Minister Scott Morrison have it with both barrels on Paul Murray's Sky News show this week.
The anger from the electorate will be like nothing Australia has seen for decades. And that anger is going to be directed at every state politician and our federal politicians for having allowed Australia alone in the world, to have 8 o'clock curfews as if we were some Soviet satellite, as if we were in Mao's China. Australian governments locking our borders, which is unconstitutional. Scott Morrison must, what a coward you are, Scott Morrison, for not taking this to the High Court, because it is unconstitutional to shut our borders. That is in the federal constitution. You cannot stop our borders. So the anger when the Australian people realise their lives have been destroyed, careers destroyed, our kids committing suicide. We're now talking about suicide clusters. Let me tell you, the anger will be white hot.
That's Rowan Dean on Sky News.
You're listening to The Other Side with Damian Coory. Just 20-something minutes a week to stay on top of the issues that matter.
A professor of medicine and economics at Stanford University in San Francisco says we need to have projections about the health and economic costs of lockdowns and border closures themselves before governments can make the right, balanced, sensible policy decisions on COVID-19. Dr. Jay Bhattacharya told former Australian Deputy Prime Minister John Anderson in this week's edition of his podcast, John Anderson Direct, that the first stage of getting to good public understanding and better policy is to overcome our fear.
That, more than anything else, has driven the division over COVID policy. This abject fear of what the disease is. It's a deadly disease. One should be concerned, but should one put aside one's rational faculties in order to just because of that fear? It makes no sense. Let's look and see, okay, how deadly is it? Let's actually consider all the costs and all the benefits. I think we have to get back to that kind of thinking, that there are trade-offs. We can't live in a utopian world where we can pretend that the virus will somehow disappear if we just shut down hard enough. If we just pay enough pain and cost, it'll go away. I mean, that's not feasible. Apparently in South Korea, there was a massive protest over this very severe lockdown they've had for a very, very long time. People around the world are feeling these costs, really feeling them. And again, it's not just to their pocketbooks; it's their entire lives. Like, what is the purpose of our lives if not to live them? And we hope for a vaccine. I hope for a vaccine, but do we really premise all of our livelihoods on whether a vaccine can be produced in an absolute record amount of time? I mean, we should invest in it. We should do the science as rapidly as we can, make sure that the data on it are clear so that we understand if the vaccine is produced, it's safe. But should we bet our entire society on that one outcome? Seems like an unwise bet.
The doctor says there are actually two epidemics, a visible epidemic, which is driving all public policy, and an invisible epidemic of mild and asymptomatic infection, which is much less severe.
That's a really important fact, which is like where all of our policies focused on the visible epidemic. Yeah. And our fear is based on the statistics that comes out of the visible epidemic. But in fact, if you want the whole picture, how really deadly is it to me? You want to take into account the invisible epidemic as well.
So to ask a layman's question, you said it was a terrible thing that the numbers might be much higher. Couldn't it also be a good thing that it points the way to herd immunity? Is that a possibility? Is that something that might be the other side of the coin?
Yeah, it certainly is a possibility. I mean, I think, it's in some sense, that also is politically charged. Herd immunity means what? Herd immunity means that enough people have got the disease so that if an additional person gets it, they will infect only one other person. They won't infect 2 or 3, and you won't get an exponential growth curve, right? There's a lot of controversy in the literature among scientists about what that number actually is. Is it 80% of the population? Is it 20%? I've seen credible reports on both. The larger number, in some sense, is actually means that we're much further along the epidemic than you might expect. That is a good thing, absolutely. It also means more people have got it, which is the bad thing, right? So it's both, and at the same time, it also means that it's less deadly than that 3.4%.
Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, Professor of Medicine and Economics at Stanford University, speaking with former Australian Deputy Prime Minister John Anderson. The professor says that there are credible scientific studies suggesting that herd immunity could be achieved at as low an infection rate as 20%, while most other studies put it at around 50 to 70%. He also addresses the question of some people getting bad after effects. Dr. Bhattacharya says this is also the case with the regular flu, and the incidence of those after effects is not as widespread as we might think from media reports. He does warn, though, that COVID is 2 to 3 times worse than the regular flu, and while these after effects that some people are having are something we should keep an eye on, he says it should not be driving our public policy.
I mean, it's a serious condition we should think about carefully, but we live our lives with lots of serious conditions that we think about carefully, and yet still we live our lives. I think to me, I'm a health economist, so I always think about trade-offs. And the question is, what is the trade-off here? If we shut down our lives for an extended period of time, what will we get from it? What will we lose from it? And that to me is the key policy question. Right. If we think about shutting down our lives for a long period of time, well, we get unemployment, we get poverty, especially poor people getting hurt. We get depression, we get suicides, we get long run health effects of the lockdowns on the one side versus the avoided cases from COVID-19 on the other. Right. That's the benefit. Is it worth it? Well, the question is, can we expect the lockdown to permanently address COVID? And the answer is no. Right? We have not ever cured it or eliminated a disease with a lockdown.
New Zealand's just discovered that.
Indeed, it has. I mean, it's unfortunate, but I mean, New Zealand, of course, is in some sense a unique place. It's an island, 5 million people. You can actually, maybe if it could work anywhere, it would work there. Right? They stamped out the disease, they thought, and yet it's popped back up. I think I was seeing like 70 or 100 more cases already in just the past week. It's an incredibly infectious disease, hard to stamp out, and you can't isolate yourself from the world forever.
Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, Professor of Medicine and Economics at Stanford University in San Francisco, speaking with former Australian Deputy Prime Minister John Anderson. A conversation you do not want to miss. And you can find the whole half-hour discussion on YouTube. The link is in our program notes today. And I also strongly recommend following John Anderson's podcasts. His interviews are great. You can find more at johnanderson.net.au. And that's John with an H and Anderson with an O.
This is The Other Side with Damian Coory, the Aussie podcast featuring all the people that The Drum, Q&A, and The Project somehow just don't seem to have time for.
One of the scariest stories in Australia this week, in my view, is the news about China's 1,000 Talents scheme. This scheme was established in 2008 by the Communist Central Government of China to recruit leading experts in, quote, scientific research, innovation and entrepreneurship. Not stupid, smart policy for any government, I guess. Get out there and seize the best talent in the world. However, our allies, the United States and Canada, have long warned that China intends to use scientists who are involved with this plan to gain access to new technology for economic and military advantage. Well, now the Australian newspaper's Sharri Markson has completed an extensive investigation into the scheme and how it's operating here in Australia. The way it works here is that the Chinese government gives the Aussie academics nice salaries and perks, and in return gets access to their innovations and patents. Australia's main China watcher is the chair of the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security, Andrew Hastie. Since 2015, Andrew's been the Liberal Party member for the federal seat of Canning over in Perth. He's only 37 years old, and he's a former SAS soldier. Thank God we've got millennials like Andrew in this country. Well, Mr. Hastie appeared on Peter Credlin's program on Sky News after the Australian's big report came out this week, and he made a pretty good point. He said that universities are sovereign institutions. They're where our national learning and research takes place. And government funds Australian Research Council, the Australian Research Council, to the tune of $780 million a year. Or should I say the taxpayers fund it? Of course, the government funds nothing. Productive members of society who pay tax fund everything. Let's not forget that. Anyway, we now know that some of that hard-earned Aussie money may be funding Chinese military developments and the Chinese surveillance state, as Mr. Hasty explained on Sky News. Listen.
And what this story today by Sharry Markson reveals is that many of our scientists indeed have contracts through the 1,000 Talents program in China, whereby their intellectual property, their research is harvested, it appears, by the Chinese state. And potentially, we might be indirectly funding programs that go to military developments in China, developments in artificial intelligence, which could be used to enhance the unblinking eye of the Chinese surveillance state insofar as it monitors minorities like the Uyghurs in Xinjiang province and also the persecuted church. So I have big concerns, as do my colleagues.
Once again, the Australian university sector has failed us. A lot of the unis don't even know that their academics are in this scheme. Is there a sector in Australia we need to clean up more than our universities?
This is The Other Side with Damian Coory, the Australian podcast for sensible centrists.
Well, it's hard to believe we are at the end of the show already. We did spend a lot of time on COVID this week, understandably, I guess. A quick update on Victoria. Daniel Andrews is back down on his plans to extend the state of emergency by 12 months. It gives police extraordinary powers to search, arrest and detain. The Premier says he's also willing to compromise on the terms of the extension and the powers that the state of emergency will give to police and health authorities. That's according to the Age newspaper. Andrews is going for 6 months now instead of 12. Maybe he was doing a bit of a Donald Trump-style negotiating thing, go in twice as high as what you want, then come back to what you wanted in the first place. The Prime Minister has suggested to Andrews that 3 months at a time might be a better idea. I didn't get a chance to mention Queensland Premier Anastasia Palaszczuk's lovely comment about how Queensland hospitals are for Queenslanders. One of the most disgusting things I've ever heard a state premier utter. No, Anastasia, Queensland hospitals are for sick people, especially your fellow Australians. We are one country. At least we used to be. And I want to draw attention to the ludicrous Queensland-New South Wales border closure, which is causing grief to so many people. Queensland Chief Health Officer Jeanette Young, basking in her newfound fame and power, this week separated mothers from their sick babies and gloriously forced one of Sydney brain surgeon Charlie Teo's Queensland patients into hotel quarantine for 14 days in Brisbane after she returned from having 2 brain tumours removed in Sydney. Apparently, Jane Brown's rural Sunshine Coast home isn't safe enough or remote enough for her to recuperate in. No, Jeanette Young, you are out of control. I also didn't get a chance to decry the terrible attack on Senator Jim Molan, one of our most switched-on politicians when it comes to defence of the nation and the China threat. He got walloped by the woke morons this week for suggesting that our universities had lost their Australianness. How dare he? I really wish the woke left would learn what racism is and what racism isn't. It's perfectly okay for Australia to worry about the Australianness of Australia's universities. Even Hong Kong universities, one of which I used to teach at, worried about losing their Hong Kong flavour if they had too many students coming from China mainland. So give it a break. Not everything is racist. God, when everything is racist, nothing is racist. That's the problem with that approach. Goodbye, everybody. I've got to say goodbye because we're coming up against a situation where this is going to be a 30-minute something podcast, not a 20-minute something podcast. This is the first piece of radio I've produced in 20 years. Please don't say that it shows. But if you like what we're doing here, please tell your friends and subscribe on every platform you can. We're on YouTube, we're on Apple, Google, Spotify, and if you'd like to really help us out and keep us going, I'd love some sponsorship. Jump onto Subscribe*, SUBSCRIBE star, and search up The Other Side or Damian Coory, and you'll see our page and how you can become a monthly supporter. And if you'd like to be an advertiser on the podcast, just drop me an email at theothersideaust, theothersideaust@gmail.com, or catch up with me on Twitter at @dcoory, DCOORY. Take care. We'll catch you next Friday morning for more of The Other Side. Have a great week.